These are magic buttonholes, and I first developed this buttonhole for this vest, which is the Fiesta vest, using my Flying Swallows stitch. And it was designed to make the most exciting use out of a short length variegated yarn, so a hand-dyed yarn with a couple of inches of colour. Each one of those sections makes one of these little motifs. However, when I finished it, I wanted a beautiful band. And the wool I used here, which was koigu, is superwash treated, and so I wanted to be able to cover my raw edge of my steek inside the band. But I also didn't want the raw edge of the steek to come peeping through my buttonholes. And anytime you do a double band, you really need to join the buttonholes of one side to the buttonholes of the other side, otherwise your button gets lost halfway through the band. So I was experimenting with the stocking stitch grafted buttonhole, and I found it a bit tedious. But if you do a reverse stocking stitch graft, you get a beautiful buttonhole on both sides of the work, and the buttonhole is joined together. I filmed this particular buttonhole in great detail, from setting up the stitches right through to the darning and at the ends, on my Finesse Your Knitting 1 DVD. Recently, however, I was asked if this buttonhole could be worked on a button band that folds this way, and the buttonholes would actually run horizontal rather than vertical. So I set to and tried it out, and here are the results, and yes, it works. This is a variation on a sewn buttonhole that I developed quite a few years back. I called it the Magic Buttonhole, and in the published material about it, I've always shown the buttonhole being worked in a band that was folded over with a turning row. In this instance, we're going to place this buttonhole on a band that folds this way, so both the buttonhole stitches on either side are pointing in the same direction. So that's the direction of knitting. That's the bottom of these stitches. You can tell that because it's the base of those 5 V's on both sides. But it works exactly the same. The preparation for the buttonhole is to knit as many stitches as you wish the buttonhole to be in a contrasting colour yarn. You knit to this position, change to your contrasting yarn, work the appropriate number of stitches, slip those stitches back to the left hand needle, and then resume working with your main colour yarn, so the main yarn is never broken. We begin near the folding end of the buttonholes. So the fold is here. The first thing we do is copy the side of that first stitch. So we go parallel to the tail. And we're working from the inside of the band. And again, we go parallel to the end of that buttonhole. From here, we go back into the hole we came out from, and you do the opposite to that contrasting bump, purl bump. So go under and up. Just push the tails out of the way, back to where you came from, so that purple yarn came out of that stitch there. And from here on, you just go back to where you came from and do the opposite to the pink purl bump, all the way along the side of your buttonhole. Although the tails are irritating, it's better to cut them and make each buttonhole with a separate piece of yarn. Otherwise you tend to find you get a tight piece of yarn between the buttonholes, which distorts the stitches and makes them harder to copy. Choose really bright colours for clarity. Now when you get to the end of the buttonhole, you'll find that there are no more purl bumps to copy. And then you go back into the same hole and go parallel with the side of that last stitch. Back into the same hole, parallel with the side of the last stitch. Now we're going up the other side of the buttonhole, so over to the opposite fabric, into the same hole, and up the other side of the buttonhole. You don't want to pull these stitches tight. They should be about the same tension as your knitted stitches. And you can find more detailed, more step-by-step instructions in my Magic Buttonhole technique sheet, or on my video Finesse Your Knitting 1 DVD. As you come to the end, you might have to stretch things out a bit, but you're continuing to go back to where you came from. Do the opposite to the purl bump, under and up, until you get back to where you started. At this point we can check our buttonhole, and this is what it looks like on the public side. There should be a hat on each one of those V's, so there's 5 hats there and 4 on the underside. We had 5 stitches to begin with, and then the 2 parallels, the diagonals at either end. And oh look, I have missed something here, so we can actually see that that's wrong. So I need to go back and rework those because I've strayed away from the edge of my waste yarn. So this one was correct, this one was correct, but here I've actually gone into the wrong position. Now if we have a look at this side again, we can see where I went wrong. So that one was good, that one was good, that one was good, but here I didn't go back exactly into the same spot. I missed a little bit, so I need to go back in here. So I'm going to take this out. It's always a really good idea to practice this buttonhole a couple of times, make a little swatch just like this one. You want your buttonhole fabric to be quite firm to support the buttonhole. So here is where I went wrong. I went in here and I should have gone in there. And you can see when I pull that stitch through that it looks like a stitch around the base of another one, and that's the way it should appear. Back over here. Back to where I came from. Copy carefully. Don't go away from the pink waste yarn. Back in here. And I should have known that I wasn't correct because my last stitch should be on this side. And there. Now we should be spot on. And now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hats on top of those pink V's, 2 diagonals, and 4 hats on the other side. And the other side is correct. So it's possible to be correct on one side but miss something out on the other, which is why we check both sides. And now I can remove my waste yarn. You can snip it out if you wish. I don't tend to just pull in case you have split a ply somewhere, in which case it would distort your buttonhole. So there's side one opened up. I love the look of this buttonhole because it unites the two layers in harmony. I very often make them in contrasting colours to the band because they're simply so pretty. And there is my buttonhole. Now, if this were on a real project, I'd be tempted to tighten up my stitching just a very little bit. So I'd do a couple of test buttonholes, but you see what lovely elasticity it has. And all that remains now is to finish it off inside, because you don't ever want to come back to this. So I split the plies, tie them together inside. So this is a 3-ply yarn. So I tie a ply from one to a ply from the other, and then cut them off with a tail on the inside. So I have 3 little tiny knots and 3 fluffy little tails inside, and a really beautiful buttonhole.